Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's discussion, Global Crossroads, the Americas, the US, the UN, and a new chapter of diplomacy, ? Hosted by the John Sloan Dickey Center here at Dartmouth, and welcome to Haldeman Hall, both all of you in the room. I can feel the energy already, as well as those of you who are joining us online. I'm Tori Holt. I direct the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I will not only introduce, but I get to be your moderator tonight as well. I am really excited to highlight three fantastic ambassadors that we have on campus for this conversation. I will let you know they have worked together, so they know each other, but they're also from very different countries and bring different perspectives to this conversation. And I think that's exactly what we try and do. John Sloan Dickey was famous in his time and was supported by the alumni who founded the Institute because he tried to look at great issues and encourage students and teach students how to think about great issues in the moment, and also have the skills and the knowledge to do something about it. And so it's that spirit that animates this conversation today. Many of us reading the news saw last month in New York, world diplomats, but also international leaders, global leaders lining up to give speeches in the UN General Assembly. And the first two were delivered by President Lula da Silva of Brazil, and also by President Trump of the United States. So in a sense, they both saw the importance of the United Nations as a platform, as a place to connect with diplomats. And so sometimes we might forget what a role the UN plays for that. The UN is also active across Latin America and the Caribbean, in Haiti and Colombia, and among other countries around the world. We saw US Secretary of State Marco Rubio take his first trip as Secretary of State to the region. And if I read my news correctly, that's the first time a Secretary of State went first to that region since, I think, 1912. So it really put a mark that the United States was going to be engaged. So part of our conversation is, what does that look like? What's the intersection with people from the region, and what's their view of what's going on, not just from the United States, but from the Americas and from the UN. I'm also delighted to host this conversation because it just highlights the power of the Dickey Center's Board of Visitors. This event is made possible by the Magro family, who endowed us to bring distinguished visitors here to campus. And I'm delighted that Jeff Delaurentis, Ambassador Delaurentis, is our Magro family Distinguished Visitor in International Affairs, teaching this term on campus. And I'm also delighted that the current board of the Dickey Center has joined us this evening, and they are fantastic if you get a chance to talk to them as well. So thank you to them for coming. So let me introduce our speakers for the evening. I've already mentioned Ambassador Delaurentis, so let me start there. American diplomat, he has served in Cuba, Colombia, and the United Nations. He brings a wealth of diplomatic, multilateral, and expertise both in Latin America and within the UN over a 28-year career in the Foreign Service. He played significant roles in New York and Geneva. I got a chance to work with him myself. I can attest to this. And he tried to retire and was called back in to be an ambassador at the UN during the Biden administration. So he's hopefully not called back again, but we're very happy to have him here. He's also taught at Georgetown, Harvard, Columbia, Emerson, and now Dartmouth. So we're very, very pleased that you're with us. Next, I would like to introduce Ambassador Laura Flores. So Laura Flores is also currently the director of the Americans Division in the Department of Political Affairs and Peace Building and Peace Operations at the United Nations. And so she has this whole region in her portfolio. She's very results-oriented, I understand, and she supports the prevention and resolution of conflict and the building of sustainable peace across the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. But she brings with her a lot of experience in this personally. She served her national government as a permanent representative to the United Nations, a very prominent position, and she's also been the Vice Minister for Foreign Trade, as well as has 30 years experience in diplomacy that has taken her across issues including public administration, business development, marketing, global health, public health, with multiple stints, including in Washington, D.C. So welcome. And then I'm also delighted that Ambassador Norberto Moretti is also with us. Ambassador is representing Brazil at the UN right now. He has served as the political coordinator in the UN Security Council. He's been the head of the International Peace and Security Division. He's been advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and director of the Departments of Financial Services and Financial Affairs and Services. He served all over, it looks like, South America in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for his country. He also most recently, 2019 to 2020, he served as Secretary for Foreign Trade and Economics, and also was Brazil's Sherpa for the G20 and BRICS. So he's represented Brazil further at ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, in Washington, Buenos Aires, Ottawa. The list continues. And he's been a member of the UN Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund Advisory Group. So these are really amazing people who have served both for their governments within the UN and the multilateral system in international organizations. And I can't be more delighted that they've joined us. So please join me in thanking them for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, it looks like the United States has turned an eye towards Latin and South America in a way that's sort of unusual. And I think one of our conversation points tonight will be how does that look to you in your professional roles serving at the UN and also as representatives of the country or understanding the region. So I want to just start out for a moment and ask you, how do you see this moment broadly as how diplomacy is working in the Americas, the broadest sense of Americas? So each of you have a different country or area you're looking at. Maybe I could, start with you. I know that you have a vision of all the countries you're trying to think about that are both formally and informally on the agenda. But what would you say?
Thank you, Dory. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody. I recognize some faces from the previous class and the board from the website. Thank you so much. We are experiencing challenging times. I've been at the UN from different perspectives. I've worked in Panama in the country team. Then I represented my government, as you said, as permanent representative. And now I've been working the Secretariat for the last 8 years. And even these last 8 years, things are completely different. We are experiencing a very challenging moment, a moment of unpredictability. And that obviously affects the interaction among member states, among the various stakeholders of the UN. Clearly, the U.S. stance and current administration has an impact on the region, and I know we'll talk more about this, but it's I would say, summarizing it, unpredictable moment, and we just have to be nimble on our feet and adapt constantly. That's our role if we are to be successful in supporting the countries in the region, from my standpoint.
So maybe to help us understand when you say countries in the region, did Mike just, okay. I know that in your portfolio, for example, are Colombia and Haiti. So let's say take Haiti,
yes,
which is before the Security Council. And
yes.
I know the government of Panama has been very, I think, supportive of a UN authorized force to go there. Is that something you work on?
Yes,
is that on your list of challenges or bright spots?
So it's my absolute priority, and I've worked with Jeff on this, so that's how we know each other when you were in the permanent mission of the US. Haiti is one of the files in the Security Council, as is Colombia. So those are the two dossiers that we support with a special representative of the Secretary General in the country. And just with Haiti, as you asked, we have some progress the last couple of weeks with resolution approved by the Security Council where Panama sits. Yes, I'm very pleased to say that I put forth Panama's candidature when I was a permanent representative 10 years ago, and now Panama is sitting on the council, so I'm very happy to be able to work with them for one of the countries in the region, Haiti in this case. And Haiti has gone through multiple iterations. Ambassador Moretti has also worked on this file when he was in the Security Council. And we're really hoping that this time around we're going to be able to see things through, because ultimately it's a question of resources. So multinational security support mission is now being transformed into a gang suppression force, sponsored and promoted by the United States. And we're really hoping that this takes the security situation in Haiti to a next level that enables the environment for elections, which have not happened in Haiti for the last 10 years, and on a road to the recovery of the democratic institutionality the country needs.
Well, thanks. And so maybe Ambassador Moretti, I know that Brazil really has emphasized multilateral solutions and at the same time defend sovereignty. And not to put you on the spot about Haiti, but you've worked on it, and I remember force commanders from Brazil serving in Haiti. Tell us how you think it's being thought about today. It's supportive, but would it provide support directly to Haiti, to a mission there, or political muscle behind the scene, or maybe that's not Brazil's priority right now?
First of all, thank you very much for having us here today. It's quite an experience, and I'm very happy to be here with two friends, Ambassador Delaurentis, Ambassador Flores. We work together in different files. Haiti. But before talking
Well,
about Haiti,
tell us about Brazil's priorities, and I'm
Okay.
just wondering, is Haiti one of them or not?
Okay, sure. I had the opportunity to discuss with some of Ambassador Delaurentis' students before this event. And although Brazil, as other countries, have specific priorities, issues that they're focusing on, in our case, our key priority today at the UN, but in other fora, is to really preserve multilateralism, the multilateral system, and with that, international law. We feel that, and I think the vast majority of member states of the UN agree with that, that this is a time where, despite the obvious need to reform, find efficiencies in the system, it's a time to hold the fort to some extent and make sure that the system delivers, but also that the system is preserved, the system is strengthened. It's in the interest of certainly a middle power such as Brazil, but even more so of the smaller states. So that's the key systemic priority, if you want. On Haiti, you kindly reminded us of the role Brazil played in Haiti, especially in MINUSTA. We were there for 13 years, and all the force commanders were Brazilian.
A peacekeeping mission, right?
That's right. The peacekeeping mission called MINUSTA that was operating there in Haiti from 2004 to 17, if I'm not mistaken. And Brazil was the largest troop contributor with Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, but was basically a Latin American effort to some extent, especially in much more South American, but Latin American effort. And today, it strikes us that actually this is not a Latin American effort at this point in time, but much more a Caribbean effort, and one can wonder why. I think, to be very frank, there is a fatigue in the region regarding Haiti, and the Haitian authorities, I think, acknowledge that. But also, there is a perception that, and this I think explains to some extent why many Latin Americans at this point in time are not volunteering or ready to contribute. The situation in Haiti is worse, is more precarious than it used to be when MINUSTA, for example, was terminated in 2017. And the stakes in Haiti are quite high for anyone going in and helping stabilize the situation. One needs to ponder very carefully how to do it, how the UN will do it, and how police contributors or troop contributors will help. So at this point in time, Brazil is considering possibilities of supporting the UN effort, but at this point in time, there's no decision to contribute concretely or with forces to the GSF. GSF, by the way, is the gang suppression force.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of interesting because the United States, the tables have turned a bit, is a huge advocate of a force in Haiti, 5,500, for gang suppression, and is actively trying to recruit countries, probably including Brazil, from the region to deploy. And your country supports multilateralism. So I'm kind of seeing a contrast because President Trump did not get up and give a speech about the importance of multilateralism. He criticized the UN, and it's a mixed signals sort of moment. Ambassador Delaurentis, Jeff, if you don't mind, you've worked in this region, but you also are a keen observer of sort of U.S. policy now that you're out of government. You've seen us now, the U.S., engage in the region. What does that look like to you? What do you think what we're focused on there?
I think we're at an interesting moment, in part because maybe the United States, the administration, has a different view from the one that Ambassador Moretti just articulated in terms of multilateralism and international law. My sense, and you see it, a lot of analysts talk about this, that the view from Washington seems to be the rules-based international order is broken or breaking, and things are it's more about competition and scrambling for resources. And so it's viewed in a different way. And I think that affects the way that the United States is operating in the region. At the beginning, we heard Secretary Rubio talk about we won't ignore the region as others have. That was, I think, hopeful, wanting to engage neighbors. But it becomes a bit contradictory because, on the one hand, thankfully, we were leading in the effort to secure adoption of the resolution on the gang suppression force, which is a good thing. But at the same time, we're not paying our peacekeeping bills, and we're sending rescissions to Congress, which would suggest that we may not be paying our peacekeeping bills. So there's a contradiction there. I think it's important for the U.S. to seek burden sharing with this kind of mission. That's certainly appropriate and useful. And frankly, last year for the multinational security support mission, when I was still with the Biden administration, I went around knocking on doors for support to Brazil and to Panama and to other countries. It's a tough sell, of course. But it's critical for Haiti. It's critical for the Caribbean, and so I hope the U.S. remains very engaged in leading on that issue, and maybe we'll find a way to contribute its fair share as well.
You served in Cuba, which is also on the administration's agenda, and I don't know how the UN is dealing with that right now. Do you want to share any observations of where you think the U.S. is, where we are with our Cuba policy?
Well, I think the Cuba policy in terms of the U.S. is well, not to be glib, but I would call it revenge and retribution. I don't see any other way to describe it. It's been the same for many, many years. In the Obama administration, we tried to change the dynamic. We thought we could have more impact, frankly, as things were beginning very slowly to change, to help accelerate that change by engaging in all sorts of ways. The next administration decided that was the wrong way to go and reverted back to a more traditional policy, and I think that's where we are now. And my sense is that there are some folks in the administration who feel that Cuba is in such bad shape that it's only a matter of time before things become extremely difficult, and in their perspective, maybe change will happen that way. I think it's a dangerous approach because the result will be millions of folks fleeing to the United States and other places. But they seem to be fairly set in that policy for the duration of the administration.
So where do you see cooperation that is in the Americas but in the UN system at the same time? Do you see areas to collaborate between the countries in the region? You've mentioned Haiti and Colombia. Are there other countries, whether it's, say, Venezuela is certainly in the news. It looks like the U.S. has put a large military deployment in the area. Is there any unity of interest around democracy? The theory is slowing immigration and drug trafficking, or is that an area where the region has a very different view of what's going on, as an example? Or maybe Colombia you'd like to talk about. But help us understand a bit more of the nuance of what's going on in the region with your government's views, with the UN views, and what the U.S. is doing. Would you like to start?
I can start. So, I mean, the region has multiple challenges that cut across borders, and that is important to understand. And therein is the value of the UN space to collaborate and to talk, to dialogue. The region has had multiple efforts at integration. Of course, we have the OAS, which is the Organization of American States, which has not been as effective in dealing with issues like Venezuela. They stepped out. Cuba is not there. On Haiti, they've started to work a little more collaboratively with us, and we need them as well. But it is a moment of deep polarization, having to do with, well, the swings, the typical political swings to the right, to the left, and the lack of alignment, which is very important for tackling these transboundary issues like migration, transnational organized crime, which is co-opting states and going into the governance structures of various countries. Take Ecuador, for example, which has seen, otherwise paradise country 5 years ago. It's now really experiencing a very difficult security situation. So it's a moment of.
Can you say why they're experiencing a difficult situation?
Well, because of the transnational organized crime, the criminal organizations are deeply entrenched in the governance structures of the country, and that has become rendered it very insecure. So there's a space for the UN to provide the collaborative entourage for these countries to talk, but it's very difficult because currently, going back to the U.S. administration, what we're seeing is rather than uniting on these transboundary fronts, we are seeing very transactional collaboration responses to in the General Assembly, you see voting on resolutions, for example, very to the moment, very trying to align. I mean, my country, Panama, has been put in a very difficult position with Trump zooming into the canal early on in the administration.
Maybe tell people what that reference is.
Yes, and it's really. I feel like countries are prioritizing the bilateral more than the multilateral.
Okay.
And going back to the Cuba embargo, it's coming up for vote in the General Assembly. And I think it's a litmus test also to see where countries are. It's like a very black and white, I know the U.S. government is pressuring specific countries. I mean, Brazil had ended up voting on the Bolsonaro, of course. Against, I know the U.S. for this vote is pressuring, the likes of Panama, Ecuador, more friendly governments, let's say, on the right, center right, to vote with the U.S., Israel, the usual. So that's going to become a very that'll be an interesting litmus test. But it's a time of polarization and division when we need the opposite.
Do you see a place where that kind of where governments could come together? You've named a number of security, democracy, slowing immigration, trying to stop drugs, crime. I mean, all those are things that most governments want to stop. Mm-hmm. Do you see areas where there could be collaboration and work together, Ambassador?
I think so, and that's the sad part of it, I think, because if you go around and ask, all governments will be willing. They will agree on a priority agenda, I think, or part of a priority agenda, and they are, I think, ready to work together. But I agree with Ambassador Flores that the two things that are complicating these efforts now there are many, but two are: one, the depolarization within the region, especially South America. A group of countries going to the right, a different group of countries going to the left. And unfortunately, in South America, we have not been able to ring-fence integration efforts from ideological or political variations in countries. And secondly is what seems to be the preference of the Trump administration for bilateral dealings rather than collective efforts. And being bilateral means not necessarily having the same priorities or taking the same approaches to the whole region about the same problems. And thirdly, and this is more recent, but the operations in the Caribbean and now in the Pacific does bring bad memories to a region that is, to some extent, still traumatized by past U.S. action. And my feeling, I may be wrong, but my feeling is that regardless of the ideological, political differences among governments in the region, they all feel uncomfortable with the method, with the approach. And this may compromise efforts to deal with this issue cooperatively and effectively. In the UN, I think the only example of effective engagement is Haiti so far. Colombia has been a success story. I don't know whether or not it will continue to be a success story, given the latest developments in the bilateral relation between the US and Colombia. But it's been a success story. It's one of the few, actually the two, Colombia and Haiti, they have been the very few issues on which the P5 can have agreed.
Do you mind saying what the P5 is?
Oh, the five permanent members of the UN, US obviously, Russia, China, UK, and France. Haiti has been, again, the P5 there have been vetoes on whatever, but the P5 have come together despite Chinese misgivings, hesitation.
Because Haiti has diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
That's
so,
right.
and despite that, China.
So the UN Security Council has been effective when it comes to Latin American issues. That's good. Again, I don't know how it will evolve. But again, should the US be more, I think, prone to a more collective and cooperative approach, I think the results would be better.
Okay. I'm going to let everybody here know. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn to all of you. So please think about how I can get you into this conversation. Please raise your hands. And I will prioritize students. So maybe just picking up on this point about being uncomfortable with the approach, maybe we could get a little more which approach by which country.
Okay.
Or maybe implying United States, and is it the U.S. use of force against potential drug smugglers, but without authorization, without much of a, is that I want to draw out of you what you're
Sure,
referring to. Is
sure.
that the
Fair
case,
enough,
or is there
fair
another
enough.
case, or is it something else?
Maybe I'm being too diplomatic. But I mean, I think everybody has been following the news. I think the US now has attacked eight boats, 6 in the Caribbean, 2 on the Pacific coast, claiming that they have robust intelligence that tell them that they are drug traffickers. They're all in international waters, so they're not infringing upon the sovereignty of any specific country. There are, again, being diplomatic, there are many doubts, both in the US, on the legality of those actions. Again, both from a domestic law perspective and from an international law perspective. But the fact is that, the operations have taken place. And what I mentioned of discomfort is that, again, there are countries closely aligned with the US at this point in time in the region. There are countries that are not aligned with the US in this region. But the use of force is what I think brings discomfort even to those countries that are aligned with the Trump administration. Because again, they have memories. And one indication, I don't want to be too specific here, but one specific indication of this degree of discomfort is that, as you might know, two of the persons that were in one of those boats survived the attack. One is a Colombian national, the other is an Ecuadorian national. The U.S., I understand, has delivered these 2 persons to their respective governments. And Ecuador, who's closely aligned with the U.S., decided not to prosecute this person and released the person. This, I think, this is an indication of the potential pressures of the domestic political opinion on how the U.S. is handling this issue.
Internal to Latin American countries. Or
Ecuador specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, because the Ecuadorians have said that this individual didn't break any Ecuadorian laws, and so there was no reason to hold him.
And we have human rights independent experts calling these nearly 32, I think now, deaths extrajudicial killings, because again, the U.S. has skirted international law, and said that they are happening in international waters, so there's no infringement on sovereignty, even though there is some indication that one may have happened because of this survivor in Colombia was not far enough away from the time that they left their fishing village to where they were attacked. and there's talk that they may have still been in Colombian waters. So I mean, there's just a lot of discomfort. I think you used the right word. And this, interestingly, may have maybe a joining force, for countries on right or left, like against, the use of force in general. The Venezuelans clearly are very actively engaged in and have called a session in the Security Council. Russia has the presidency, so they had a friendly ear to host this session a week ago, calling the world to pay attention because there's an impact on regional peace and security, and this is what the Security Council is meant to uphold. No? And it was an interesting session because it was neither nor, how to say. There were calls against what some countries call the regime in Venezuela, and there was no support for the U.S. So, the Venezuelans didn't achieve their purpose, the U.S. didn't achieve their purpose, but it was put out there in the open. So that was, I thought, an interesting question. But I don't know, Jeff, from your experience, this deployment.
But in a way, in a way, we're bumping against one of the challenges, I would say, in the international system. Of course, the attacks on these ships are controversial. There are debates back and forth in the U.S. about the legality and so forth. But then when you think about, Russia calls a session of the Security Council on the value of the UN Charter. It's a bit rich. And Venezuela, which is, let's face it, Maduro is completely illegitimate. He lost the election, but managed somehow, miraculously, to stay in. It's a bit hard to take what they're trying to do very seriously. And I think on our side, at least on the U.S. side, often there is a frustration that countries in the region are not as vocal about, say, Maduro's illegitimacy, and so I think we have to deal with that. But a broader point, I think, is and that's the inconsistency that I think we're all still wrestling with. It's still early days in the administration. We were reading in class the declaration that came out of Sharm el-Sheikh. Pivoting out of the region for a second, and there was a lot of good language in there about working with other countries and the importance of human dignity for Israelis and Palestinians. And you can take out some of the flourishes, but I thought that was quite interesting, and you see that in other places. And the administration still hasn't completed or released its comprehensive review of all of the international organizations the U.S. belongs to. They were going to do this review. They announced in February. It was supposed to be finished by August 4th. That was 180 days. We're still waiting for the results. The national security strategy still hasn't come out. So I don't know. We may see language and principles that will surprise folks in terms of the administration's interest in dealing with other countries.
And sometimes the U.S. can debate internally
Yeah.
and have different points of view. And maybe
Sure.
we're seeing some different points of view come out. President Trump prioritized talking about peace agreements that he was part of at his speech at the UN. In a strange way, most governments would appreciate that he cares about negotiating for peace, right? I think it's just sort of amplifying your point. All right, I would love to see some hands. Okay, and we'll have a microphone that will come to you. I see the young lady right here.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a 29 from Asheville, North Carolina. And I actually just spoke with you guys earlier in class. But I wanted to ask, I think my overwhelming background of the Americas is more historical than political. And so kind of my knee-jerk reaction to U.S. involvement is, as Ambassador Moretti said, that the region is still traumatized by past U.S. action. I think of the banana republics and lots of CIA intervention and whatnot. And I wanted to ask kind of how that mixed with how Ambassador Flores has talked about how the Americas kind of look at the U.S. as a model for democracy, and the U.S.'s involvement in prioritization in multilateralism is very important, from funding to influence. But kind of how all of that works around the relationship of the last 150 years that's been rather exploitative of Central America, especially if we kind of look at how Trump is almost re-invoking the Monroe Doctrine and this kind of Western Hemisphere influence, and how that all works together.
Okay, thank you for kicking us off. Who would like to start there? We have too many potential speakers, so I need to pick on somebody. Ambassadors?
Jeff?
I'll just say that, look, there's been there have been tremendous efforts in the last 20 years, maybe, to get beyond the history that the United States has in the region. We can't deny that we intervened in Guatemala in 1954. And on and on, well into the 1980s. There are some folks in the U.S. who still feel that was justified for various reasons. A lot of it was driven by the Cold War, and in some cases for good reasons, in other cases not so good. But I think there's been enormous effort since probably the administration of George H.W. Bush, and then into the Clinton period. Certainly even in the administration of George W. Bush, of course 9/11 got in the way, but a strong sense of Mexico and the region south of Texas and so forth. So I would like to think that we've overcome a lot of that. I know there's still echoes and feelings in the region about U.S. interference, involvement, and so forth. I mean, we have to say when President Trump talked about the trial of former President Bolsonaro in Brazil, that certainly would have stirred up a lot of concern. But and yes, you can feel a little bit of a Monroe Doctrine feel if you assume that the administration is kind of interested in spheres of influence versus a more multilateral approach. That's certainly a theory that's bandied about, and that would maybe explain his actions in Panama. That would explain his actions with respect to Greenland, although we've not heard much about either in the last few months. But I would like to think that we've moved beyond that, and there certainly have been many efforts across several administrations to develop equal, solid relationships particularly with all of the democracies in the region, and most of the countries in the region are of course democracies, whether they veer right or left. I don't think that matters so much.
All right, thank you. All right. Hands. I see a bunch of hands. Okay, we have right here and back here.
Hello again. I remember talking to you guys from class before. My name is Issa Allison. I have a bit of a fun question for you guys. So, if we somehow moved into a world where the Permanent Five were not so like wanting to hold on to their power in the Security Council, and they actually wanted to expand it to add 2 more permanent seats, what countries or regions do you think?
Brazil.
I had a feeling you said
That was an easy one.
would be like best fitting for that role outside of like your current like relationship to certain countries. Like, what countries do you think would be most deserving of that, or would be able to bring that perspective that makes the Security Council actually more cohesive for the entirety of the world?
I can take that
Yeah,
one. Start with that one. For those who might not know, Brazil for a long time has held the position or the proposal or the position that the council should be expanded in both categories, meaning permanent members and non-permanent members. There is a whole set of reasons for that. It's a tough sell. as I said in the class, power lacks itself. So it's very unlikely that those holding power will gladly share it with others, unless they see a benefit for it. And in many cases, big powers have seen benefit in sharing power to some extent. G20, for example, is an example of that. Entirely different from the Security Council, obviously, but they acknowledged that in 2008, actually in 1997, 2008 at the summit level, they recognized, they acknowledged that the distribution of wealth in the world was such that to handle some problems, they needed everybody relevant at the table. So there have been examples. Security Council is much hard to sell for many reasons, including the fact that it deals with peace and security. It deals with the authority and the authorization to use force. So that's not a small thing. But to answer your question directly, if I understood you correctly, what countries other than the obvious candidate, Brazil, and I'll stay in the global south, I think it's increasingly difficult to explain why, for example, India is not sitting at the council as a permanent member. India is one member of one coalition that Brazil is a part of, the G4 countries, Brazil, India, Japan, and Germany. But it's, again, quite obvious why India should be sitting on the council. And I'm being very disciplined in not talking about Brazil.
I think Nicholas had his hand up back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicholas Opio. I'm a Ugandan human rights lawyer who is taking part in the Dissident in Residence program here at the Dickey Center. My question is kind of related to what
Could
my
you
colleague
speak a little
asked.
louder? We're having a hard time hearing you. Yeah.
Great. My question is related to what my former colleague asked, which is the question of the reform of the UN. Many African countries have clamored for urgent reforms of the UN, not just the UN Security Council. I wonder what your views are about the demands of African countries to reform the UN and to ask for 5 seats on the UN Security Council. My own president, President Yoweri Museveni, has led this campaign, and it would be interesting to hear what your views are, especially in relation to the African continent. The second part of the question is to ask you what your views are about the Kenyan forces deployment in Haiti, and how you think it has impacted the dynamics in Haiti, or whether it is in fact necessary, especially given the undertones about a black nationalism or Pan-Africanist approach to, or reason for deploying Kenya in Haiti.
Thank you. All right. Great question.
I can start. I appreciate the question on the UN reform. There's many angles. I mean, you talked a bit about the Security Council, but I mean, this is an 80-year-old bureaucracy, and the world has changed drastically since the UN was created. 50 plus members at the time, 193, most of the African nations included later. So the question touches on from not representation in the Security Council to staff, geographic representation in the Secretariat, countries graduating to the next level, and presence of the UN in the countries. I mean, we're now in the UN 80 reform process, and and perhaps Ambassador Moretti also has views on this from the member state perspective. From the Secretariat, this is something that, I mean, in part because of the liquidity situation caused by US and others not paying, we are facing a cash-strapped organization that doesn't produce income, that needs to figure out how to continue working, how to continue providing services to the member states. And we're having to take some drastic decisions. Unprecedented, 20% staff reduction in the Secretariat. Now the proposal is to be decided by the proposal by the Secretary General is to be decided by the General Assembly, but we will surely see a reduction and a need to reprioritize, to refocus, to do some sort of triage, because we have grown in mandates, we have grown in We've expanded our sphere of influence. I'll use that. But the question is, are we really addressing the critical world's issues? So it's really important, the question that you asked in terms of reform, and I see it, and it's hard to see from inside, but I strongly believe that we need to take some serious steps, and it's not an easy task. And I can go to the Haiti question right away. Thank you for asking the question. Back to Haiti. The Haiti is dear to my heart. The Kenyan-led multinational security support mission, which is just over a year now, has done amazingly considering the resources that they were given, and this was a big part of the shortcomings, the lack of resources,
maybe just tell people what they were there to do.
They were there to restore security in a situation where the capital, Port-au-Prince, is like 90% taken over by gangs. And now they're expanding into other departments of Haiti. So this really renders the country, it's very difficult to operate in a context, as I said earlier, where there are no elected officials for the last 10 years. So the question of security is paramount to figuring out the situation in Haiti. And Ambassador Moretti mentioned about the Latin Americans having been very active in the region, and now the shift going more to the Caribbean, who are helping politically to come to a political solution in Haiti. And also African countries have risen up to support Haiti. And this is in part due to what I think is a very beautiful rapprochement that has happened over the last few years between Haiti and the African origins. And this happened, do you recall, Ambassador Rhonda King of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Security Council, who pushed forth this alliance of the Africa Tree. There's always 3 African nations in the Security Council, plus one or two Latin Americans or Caribbean. And at the time when the Caribbean was in the Security Council, and that role is now played by Guyana, they come together as a unified position, and that has brought the Africans closer to our region, and especially to Haiti. So I think this is an alliance that is here to stay, and I would like to see that evolve, and the African nations support more the solutions to Haiti.
I should just mention that the genesis of bringing the Kenyans into this particular force, I think, began really with a very dynamic Kenyan permanent representative who argued in the Security Council that essentially all efforts up until that point with respect to Haiti, not blaming the UN, but essentially blaming those countries who were leading these efforts, essentially the West, United States, Canada, European countries, that they clearly hadn't done the job. They hadn't been successful as everyone had hoped. And therefore, an African perspective was necessary to be brought into the mix. And that then led to them offering to send police. And unfortunately, frankly, the police, the leadership and the police themselves, I think, are absolutely first rate. But the resolution that we negotiated called for 2,500, and only 1,000 came. Why? Because we couldn't find the funds to support the additional troops that were needed. Same with equipment. It was a very hard sell to other countries to secure this kind of equipment. So I think the idea was a very good one, and as Ambassador Flores said, I hope it will continue in this interest. But if they weren't successful, it was because they really weren't given the resources they needed to be successful. In terms of UN reform, I can't help but say this. Toward the end of the Biden administration, we did make a proposal to add 2 permanent seats from Africa to the Security Council, and I think a few others. I would have liked to have seen the administration move much earlier in its term on this issue than it did, but it did put forward that proposal, which I think was met with general support It's a tough sell. Not that particular provision, but Security Council reform in general. There are, Ambassador Moretti mentioned very correctly that India should be on the Security Council. The United States, at least in past administrations, believe very strongly that India should be on the Security Council. Fine, but its neighbor will do everything it can to make sure it's not on the Security Council.
And they're on the Security Council
Right,
now.
right. And moving to Japan, I think China will do everything it can to make sure Japan never becomes a permanent member of the Security Council. So there's still a lot of negotiating and politicking to do on this issue, unfortunately.
If I may just comment on two things. One, Kenya, Haiti. Kenya is to be highly commended for the bat it made and for the assistance it provided in very difficult circumstances, as Ambassador Delaurentis mentioned. So truly commendable. On Security Council reform, I think everybody agrees that should we have a reform that will expand the number of permanent members, African member states should be there. The number 2 seats that would bring to 5, 3 non-permanent, 2 permanent members from Africa. Everybody recognizes that there is called the historical injustice against Africa. I would only say that the same historical injustice has been made to our region, Latin America and the Caribbean. We have no member state that is a permanent member of the Security Council.
Members. Most of us are founding members.
That's right. On just one quick question on reform, on UN reform. As Ambassador Flores mentioned, there is this initiative initiated by or launched by the Secretary General called UN 80, comprehensive effort. There's one issue that I'd like to draw your attention to, which is the vision of the UN behind some of these initiatives or proposals. For example, the US administration, and this is official, understands that the UN should go, quote, go back to basics, end quote. By this meaning that the UN should basically take care of peace and security and not the other 2 pillars of the charter and the history of the organization. This has no support at all.
Remind us the other pillars.
Human rights and sustainable development. The 3 of them are called for in the principles of the charter of the UN and the principles of the charter. Principle of the UN as registered or called for in the charter. This has no support at all. But the concern, I would say even the suspicion among member states is that given the share of the US contribution, although it does not pay in full, or the decision to withdraw from a number of entities of the system, or dramatically reduce its voluntary contributions to the system. And at the UN, when you say system, you say agencies, funds, and programs. UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women, that kind of thing. Will, if not conceptually, in practice, lead to an unbalanced organization. One in which peace and security matters would be better funded, if not fully funded, would be better funded. And peace and security and human rights, development, sustainable development, and human rights would be even more underfunded or unfunded at all if compared to the current situation.
I feel obliged to say that, that of course, the U.S. for decades and decades have been, I would say, extraordinary supporters financially of all of the, almost all of the funds and programs. Occasionally, there's 1 or 2 that the U.S. will pull out of temporarily, but we have a very long record of supporting humanitarian assistance across the board, and sometimes, I guess, folks in the U.S. feel that that isn't necessarily recognized, and everyone focuses on the assessed contribution to the UN Secretariat and other bodies that is correctly often bandied about in Congress and by various administrations, depending upon who's in power.
All right, I'll make a quick comment. I think I saw some hands over here. Who has the microphone? Maybe we could take a few in a row. Some students over here in the third row back. Yeah, please. But while we're teeing that up, I mean, the U.S. is the largest assessed contributor to the UN, and it was the largest voluntary contributor to the UN.
Yeah.
And so if the U.S. is in arrears, which it's been for years,
Yeah.
it's now withholding its current assessments, which are, most lawyers say are legal requirements, plus we're voting for the thing, and then it's asking for no new money. This is a different time, it feels
Yes,
like.
exactly.
And perhaps what you're pointing to is the gap between that policy and any kind of public discussion of it, which I think most Americans aren't. There's so much going on, they're not tracking on this.
Right.
But it
I
would,
think
I
that's
think
true.
you're all arguing, it'll have effects for both our standing in the institution and our ability to get things done, as well as the functionality of the UN system itself. So just to elaborate a little, and maybe I'll come back to that. But I think the microphone has made its way over here. Please, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Juliet. I'm a 28. You talked briefly earlier about how working through the OAS can have its challenges sometimes. I was just wondering, since that's a different system that is very relevant to obviously like Latin America in a way that it isn't anywhere else because it is American states, if there are any issues where it is more effective to go through the OAS than UN systems?
Working for the OAS, the UN.
Any issues or areas of focus where it can be more effective to use OAS systems
got it.
than
Than the
UN
UN,
systems, just due to the differences in enforceability between the two. Thank you.
And just because I saw a bunch of hands, why don't we take a bunch, and then we'll turn back to our panel. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Vincent. I'm a 28. So, Ambassador Flores, I heard you mention about how U.S. pressures in order to vote a certain way, and how how an example of a litmus test, specifically the Cuban sanctions, in this time of polarization and division. So I kind of wanted to ask how has the polarization diverted dynamics in Latin America, specifically focusing on U.S.-China relations, especially since the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of Latin Americans countries kind of have been joining in on that, and the most recent one kind of being Colombia. So kind of discussing how has this shifted discussions and this increasing sway of Washington towards a lot of policies towards Latin America.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I had a question regarding the scope of the United Nations. I was wondering if you believe that the United Nations should be able to punish countries or member states rather for actions done outside of the organization. What comes to mind, for example, is earlier this week, the International Maritime Organization opted to push back a decarbonization shipping plan a year due to pressures from Trump and, frankly, threats. And clearly, in my view, this goes against the UN pillar for sustainability. So do you believe that there should be a method in which the UN can do something about these actions that are outside of its organization but also affect its goals and its charters?
Okay, thank you so much. Not all of you have to answer all of those, but
Great.
why don't we just start?
Thank you for the question. So yes, we are lucky to have a regional organization in this hemisphere. Africa has the AU, which gets involved in also peace missions, and it's a very different structure. In fact, for Haiti, one of the challenges was that OAS does not get engaged necessarily in peace missions, and we didn't have a operating arm if we wanted to engage them that way. But they tend to do a lot of the they do the observation of elections, and that's a clear one. And we don't do observation elections at the UN unless it's mandated by the Security Council. So that's a huge collaborative space for the UN and the OAS whenever there are elections. We work within the PPA, Department of Political Affairs. We have an electoral affairs division that works very, very closely to the OAS, and they're always a great source of analysis and information for when they're especially contested elections. Take the ones in Venezuela last year. where the results were never revealed, divulged, and that was presented a big problem. They also, they have the Inter-American, the human rights. They do a lot of work. The courts. So we have a lot of collaboration with them. And then in terms of in Haiti, I did mention that they have a presence, the OAS in Haiti, that also supports the political process. So we work very closely with them in that regard. And they have recently produced a roadmap for Haiti under the new Secretary General, Albert Ramdim, from Suriname. It's the first time that it's a Caribbean Secretary General. So that also is very refreshing, let's say, for the region. And we look forward to collaborating with them very closely on Haiti. For Haiti, we need all hands on deck. So OAS is going to be a very good partner. And thank you for the question on U.S.-China relations. I think a lot of the current political, the policy changes and shifts from the U.S. towards the region has to do with the greater geopolitical dynamic, the competition you were mentioning with China. And China basically over the last several years, where the U.S., I will say, neglected the backyard, the immediate neighborhood, China took advantage. A very clear indicator is the rise in the shift from Taiwan to China relations. My own country, I had to do this behind the scenes when I was ambassador.
You mean that China's asking countries not to recognize Taiwan?
Right. So there were 28 or so countries back in the late 90s. I remember that number of countries in the world recognizing Taiwan, not China. Today there's 11, I think. In the region, there's still there's a couple in the Caribbean. There's Paraguay, Guatemala.
Haiti.
And Haiti, of course, which is an issue. But in the last 10 years, in Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua most recently, Panama, República Dominicana, switched alliance, let's say, to diplomatic relations with China away from Taiwan. So I think that has a big impact and an influence on what the U.S. is now trying to do. Like suddenly, wait a minute, China, the Belt and Road Initiative, humongous infrastructure projects, El Puerto, the recent port, ¿cómo que se llama? In Peru. They are here and they work slowly, quietly, but they are in the region. So I think this is one of those wake-up moments for the U.S. in terms of to your question. Yeah.
Thank you. All right.
Just a quick comment on the scope of the UN and the relationship with other, what we call the UN specialized agencies. I understand the International Maritime Organization is one specialized agency, but they're entirely independent. Their governance is entirely independent. Yes, there is an obvious interrelationship, thematic, if you want. The case you mentioned of an effort to decarbonize maritime transportation. Any delays or frustrations in decarbonizing whatever industry, to some extent, goes against the effort to build more sustainable economies. But again, they're entirely different. They have their governance. So it's perfectly legitimate for the organization not to take this decision at this point in time. The positions of member states is a different thing, but the UN is not in a position to interfere in that particular discussion.
All right, thanks. Any other thoughts?
Just quickly on the OAS, I would certainly like to see more collaboration between the UN and the OAS and other regional organizations. There's a growing collaboration between the UN and the AU on financing and things. The African Union. And I think that's a model for the future as the challenges are going to grow. On China, I would say I mean, I fall into the camp of someone who worries less about the declining U.S. influence. My own view is that the U.S. is still the dominant power in the world. It should think that way, and as it begins to withdraw, as it seems to be doing, there is one country who can potentially fill some of the vacuum, and that's China. And so it's a bit counterintuitive if our actions are going to actually help China. And then on just on the maritime organization, it's a really good question, because this was clearly a U.S.-Saudi Arabia maneuver. But I would say we have to be patient, and in another year or two, they'll come around.
Just add a comment,
Yes,
if I
please.
may, on U.S.-China geopolitical tensions, competition, et cetera. Two comments. One at the UN, and this is, let's say, I think it's an objective comment. As the U.S. disengages selectively, but disengages, and there have been other instances of disengagement, as Ambassador Delaurentis mentioned in the past, but I think this is of a greater magnitude, I would claim. What has also been I think a source of concern, difficulties, I mean, for the UN, but not only for the UN, is the relative unpredictability policy-wise. This has been seen at the UN as well. And China has made a clear point to show itself as the stable, reliable, predictable power. Not necessarily financially. For example, they have, we haven't mentioned it, but let's be clear, the US hasn't paid in full its contributions, but China has consistently delayed its payment to the later part of the year, not because they don't have the funds, but to make the point that they are not happy to carrying the weight, whereas the other big contributor does not. So it's been a political, just as the US in the past did not pay for political reasons, not lack of funding, but so China has also.
And a slightly different interpretation.
Okay, that's
okay.
And the comment on China and Latin America, there's one single example, very concrete example that shows the different degrees of current economic presence. Ford Motor, after 55 years operating in Brazil, decided to close its plants. And a big complex of manufacturing facilities of Ford in the Northeast were purchased by BYD, the Chinese car company, basically to produce electric vehicles in Brazil.
Yeah.
And Mercedes-Benz, after 10 or 15 years in Brazil, decided to leave Brazil in the south, and it's been in São Paulo, and now it's being purchased by GWM, which is again a Chinese vehicle manufacturing company.
Good example.
So it's a good example of increasing presence and decreasing presence.
All right. I'm noticing the time, so I'm just going to ask a final comment from each of you, but I'm going to give you a push in one or two directions. One, what's one topic that you wish people paid more attention to in the conversation we've been having? And what's one piece of advice young people who might be interested in the region, in diplomacy, or any kind of future fields, such as ones you have?
First word that popped into my head of something to pay more attention to is interconnectivity, like the spaces of collaboration. You know, at the UN, we are used to working in silos, and I think a big part of the reform has to do with closing those gaps, bridging those, development, human rights, peace and security. And unfortunately, the current world is leading the other way, and I don't want to lose the efforts that and the great progress we have made in closing gaps, and working in interconnectivity. And advice for next generation.
Potential future.
Yes.
UN officials, diplomats.
You're our inspiration, educate yourselves, learn, engage, and learn to listen, especially because I think the world is losing the capacity to listen and to connect. We are all standing on our soapboxes and talking, and we need to connect more. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Ambassador.
Well, my answers to the questions are, my answers are about one, which is, regardless of what you do in your life, professionally speaking, I think you should think very hard on the relevance of the United States in the international system and the relevance of the international system to the U.S. Different administrations in different times in the U.S. engaged differently with the international community. Those who did extensively believed that the international organization served the best U.S. interests. My personal conviction is that regardless of the needs, differences that may arise among different administrations of the U.S. and the UN, the long-term interest of the system and in the U.S. coincide in cooperation. As I said in Ambassador Delaurentis' class, the world needs the U.S., but I think that the U.S. needs the world. And in the world, the U.S. needs the UN. With, again, all the reforms needed, the adjustments, the occasional fights and disagreements, that's part of life. But this cooperation is I think, is positive for both.
All right, well, thank you. Ambassador.
So just to play off what Ambassador Moretti just said, I would say that it's important to remember that the two countries, and there are probably more, but the two countries that object most to the current rules-based international order are Russia and China. They want to do nothing but change it. And because they think that it is favorably disposed to the U.S. and its allies, and it probably is, and we should be doing everything we can to protect it. In terms of a career in diplomacy or foreign affairs, I think if you like to play three-dimensional chess and particularly on the multilateral side, and you want to walk into a room with 14 other, some adversaries, some friends, some in the middle, and try and find that sweet spot in the middle where everyone can agree to something that advances a particular issue. It's one of the best feelings in the world professionally, and I would encourage everyone to pursue it.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.